Okay, everybody, I'd like to get started. My name is TJ Pempel. I'm a professor in the political science department, and my role essentially is to introduce our speaker and to moderate the questions and otherwise to keep my mouth shut. But just a quick word or two about Professor Paul. TV Paul is the James McGill Professor of International Studies at McGill University in Canada. So he comes to us from our northern border, totally unprotected, fortunately for us. And many of you probably know that he was the president of the International Studies Association, 2016-2017. He's also been the author of 18 books.
Edited, some are edited.
Pardon?
Some are edited.
Some edited, some single-authored, and a wide number of individual articles. I actually have a contribution in a book that he did many years ago, which he may have already forgotten because he's been so busy writing other things. One of his more prominent books and more recent books is on India-China rivalry. TV has been making a name for himself both in international studies, but also in South Asian politics and South Asian foreign policy. But he's here primarily to talk to us today about his new book out from Yale University Press on restraining great powers. I won't say much about it, but it's really an interesting effort to look at how soft power is used as a way to constrain great powers as opposed to the treatment that Joe Nye gives it, which is how do great powers use it to influence lesser neighbors. So it's a flip on the traditional argument. So please join me in welcoming TV Paul.
Thank you. Thank you, TJ, for that lovely introduction, and Rexil for organizing it. I don't know where she's here. Very efficient and nicely done. And this is homecoming to some extent. I spent a couple of months a few years ago, my sabbatical, and Professor Vinay Agarwal was my host at that time, and I had a wonderful time. And I'm also an alumni of UC system, UCLA, which is, I don't know whether in the status hierarchy we are probably number 2, but that's fine. But whatever it is a wonderful time to discuss this sort of thing. This book is a result of several years of research. Some of you may recall there were a series of articles in the journal International Security where Steve Walt, Bob Pape, and myself produced this sort of logic that balancing is no longer hard balancing, it's soft balancing toward the United States. And that generated quite a bit of criticisms. And unfortunately, not many people responded to the criticism other than Robert Ott and a few others. But to my surprise, there was a lot of work going on in the regions, which they found this concept very interesting. And then I started reading, and I realized that the past 200 years of international system, international relations, soft balancing has been an important component of great power behavior, especially toward each other. So my starting point is something that you all know, but we rarely acknowledge, that the most violent actors in the international system are the great powers. This is something that is nothing to be surprised. If you may remember, in the 20th century, the number one killer was, other than natural reasons, was great power wars or great power instigated wars, the proxy wars. Some 109 million people perished in the 2 world wars. And of course, empires went and gone as a result. And great powers are prone to fighting, and I'm not naming any single one, by the way. They are prone to fight these big wars. They have engaged in intense rivalries. They can engage in crises and proxy wars, and often we give them a kind of aura that people often forget that is coming out of a 500-year-old European historical evolution. Our understanding of why great powers engage in this sort of episodic violence is still limited, I think, although there is a lot of work going on about the Thucydides trap, for instance. The great powers manage to keep an aura and legitimacy through propaganda, institutional power, sheer material power, accrued through last half a millennium of European and then USSR and American-led world systems. But to my sad thing about it is decisions of war and peace are made by a tiny group of men often, and even in liberal democratic states, sometimes reckless leaders emerge who ask their men and women to go and fight in wars, sometimes for electoral considerations, not necessarily for national interest. I won't go into all the detail because it's a very emotional subject, because this is the only one category of individuals in the world who can tell you to go and die legitimately, other than, of course, unless you are a member of Al-Qaeda or something, which is another story. Now the question is, will great power wars recur? The rise of China, the rise of resurgence of Russia, and all these are causing quite a bit of concern. Russia's behavior in the Ukraine and Baltic area. And the most important, interesting work that came out in recent time was the Graham Allison work on the Thucydides trap, which is receiving a fair amount of attention and, of course, criticism. Power transition, power cycle theories all predict wars. In fact, we don't have a good theory on peaceful change, and this is something that we hope to change by encouraging more scholarship on the subject, and because there aren't too many examples of peaceful change. There's considerable possibility for a rivalry emerging in the Pacific as we enter the 21st century, the next few decades. Already some signs are there, although surprisingly not to the extent that previous great powers jumped into the bandwagon and engaged in kind of hostile interactions. The general assumption is that great powers are restrained through their possession of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons and the mutual deterrence that keep them from engaging in the kind of war that they used to engage in. Intensified globalization, attendant economic interdependence have generated much interest that perhaps that could mellow them down. Now, what are the approaches to peace or preserving peace among great powers in the context of power transitions? And I think we need to look at some of the realist approaches here, which is based on balance of power, that is equilibrium in power. If threatening state or rising power becomes too threatening, you need deterrence and or containment, which could be economic, which could be military. And this has been the Cold War era style of interaction. And so balance of power is a very powerful theory and a belief system, which many of us forget that it comes out of the European Enlightenment thinking about equilibrium and the sort of processes that generate balancing. Balancing is often based on, of course, realist theory, the anarchic nature of the system. If you want to survive, you need to be equal in powers because the powerful attempt to dominate. And the only way to stop that is equilibrium in capabilities. And so survival and sovereign independence of individual states are possible only through a balance of power system. Now, this is a problematic one because, as we know, for some, balance of power is preponderance in power. If you ask an American strategist in the Pacific, is it equilibrium or is it American dominance and overwhelming superiority that is preserving peace? There's the notion of American pacifier, America as a pacifier, which is not based on balance of power, which is based on preponderance theory, which often is mistaken for balance of power. Balance of power is also often contested, whether it is a conscious strategy or is it an automatic process. So I kind of use the existing literature, try to show there are 3 types of balancing. Hard balancing, which is based on internal balancing through arms buildup, or external balancing through alignments. So weaker states fall together. I mean, your famous quote by Kenneth Walls, product of this place, was that weaker states will form alignments periodically whenever they find power is too much against them. Now the puzzle is why we haven't had intense hard balancing since the 1990s. That's the end of the Cold War. The United States emerged as a very powerful state. In fact, history's most powerful state, if you want to talk about. Yet, hardly any balancing coalition emerged toward it. Number of explanations are out there. Intensify globalization. The widespread availability of international institutions, the norms of territorial integrity, technological innovations of warfare that privilege defense and deterrence over offense, the absence of intense nationalism such as Nazism, fascism, Marxism, Leninism, etc. So these are often presented as, and I also agree that there is something to it, each of these factors. And so countries seem to be more concerned about balancing against threats as opposed to balancing against power. A balance of power theory in general is written like balancing against power. Balancing against threat is again an innovation that Steve Walt, one of your own products, did some years ago. And it is quite impressive in the sense that I kind of agree with him that countries seem to be worried about threats as opposed to power, unlike the traditional understanding of balance of power. So that's where I bring in this idea of self-balancing and trying to define it a little bit more carefully, unlike the previous attempts. This was one of the criticisms. It is restraining the power of a state through international institutions, concerted diplomacy, while limited informal ententes and partnerships and economic sanctions, to make its aggressive actions less legitimate in the eyes of the world, and hence its strategic goals more difficult to obtain. So we are talking about limited, tacit, and indirect balancing, and diplomatic coalitions are not military alliances, formal alliances, but informal ententes. But there's another category that I sort of look at, which is limited hard balancing, which is asymmetrical arms buildup and semi-formal alliances such as strategic partnerships, such as what United States and India today do, or Japan and India to some extent, and Russia and China. There's no formal alliances like NATO, but there is military coordination, not to the extent of Article 5, like coming to the rescue of the other if there is a war. And so this is becoming the next level of balancing, as you can see, soft to limited hard balancing, and asymmetrical because it's impossible to catch up with the most powerful states, so they're focusing, China in particular, on certain categories of weapons that can provide it defensive power or make it hard for the United States to respond. So institutions are the key source of soft balancing here. I think I am hoping that this sort of work of linking institutions with real hardcore security issues is something that needs to be supported. I mean, we have people sitting here who've done extremely important work on institutions, their role in various liberal purposes. But I think the idea of restraining great powers or using institutions as a restraint mechanism have not received the kind of attention that they should have received. We have a lot of works on institutions as facilitating transactions, reducing transaction costs, acting as vehicles of transnational participation, overcoming collective action problem, etc. And the realists in general reject institutions as epiphenomena of power, which is a total mistake. If that is the case, why are they going, the great powers going to the institutions? Why is even Mr. Trump at the UN Security Council trying to sell his version of whatever he's trying to do? None of this is to show that great powers don't use institutions or non-great powers don't use institutions for other purposes, political power, accruing power, etc. And one of the other things that I discovered in this process is institutional balancing or self-balancing can create intense nationalism and intense hostility towards international order. I have two examples. That is the fascist Italy in response to the League of Nations' effort to stop it from acquiring or controlling Ethiopia or Abyssinia, and Japan in the 1930s, which was a big target of institutional soft balancing, arms control, unequal arms control first, but then sanctions, then considerable number of institutional challenges to Japan's existence as a great power. Both created intense nationalism toward the institutions and the powers that were pushing it. So this is another, anybody, PhD student sitting here, is you can work on themes like this. Look at the nationalism that institutions can create. Often the liberals assume that institutions are not problematic, they are generating peace or whatever. But the point is they have externalities that we often ignore. Now, my effort is to understand how great powers use institutions to restrain each other's powers, and non-great powers increasingly use these institutions as well. And I think the IR literature has not done enough work on this. Both liberals and constructivists have sort of a positive view of institutions and the norms, and usually don't look at the the power politics aspect of institutions. And you don't have to be a realist. I mean, there is no harm in connecting these important players or factors in international politics if we want to understand the complexities as we are witnessing today. And what is interesting is the historical cases. I think if you ever read the book, I encourage you to read some of my historical discussion, which I was quite surprised to notice how much importance countries give to institutions, institutional restraint. And the number one case is the Concert of Europe. That's the Congress of Vienna, which inaugurated the concert, attempting to restrain the European powers from initiating another Napoleonic-style aggressive warfare. Of course, it didn't last too long, but the point is it left a certain legacy, and it's very hard to call it hard balancing. It was based on principles of institutional restraint and soft balancing. The League of Nations, I mentioned the two cases, and then this one case that is the non-aligned countries, which many people have looked down upon as a very weak, feeble effort by these very poor countries. But the more I read what you call the Bunton Process, one is wonder what went through that process. You may recall that in 1955, in the Indonesian city of Bantung, some 55 newly emerging countries met and set a number of resolutions, passed a number of resolutions. Why is it important? First time in history that these weaker actors are meeting by themselves. Nehru, that is India's former Prime Minister, Nasser, then Sukarno, and quite a few others were there, including Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai. They passed a series of resolutions, including an end to the Cold War, an end to the arms race, nuclear testing, and one of the most important one was an end to colonization, colonialism. The decolonization resolution at the United Nations was passed by the effort of these emerging states, and it played a significant role in the subsequent decolonization of Africa and remaining states. They played a significant role in what you call the nuclear test ban, the limited test ban treaty. In fact, it was Nehru who called for a standstill agreement, because there was genuine fear of a third world war, and they all thought they would sucked into it. And they had a series of impact on nuclear-free zones. NPT, by the way, which was initially proposed by the smaller states, took over by the great powers. And new international economic order. Obviously, not all these were successful. But the point is they did create what you call the norm entrepreneurship. And it had an impact. And Mikhail Gorbachev is the one who really took up all that and tried to end the Cold War. So I tell sometimes, not in the book, that if Nehru was alive in 1991, he would have been the happiest man. All he wanted happened. The Cold War ended, which is not something that we should ignore. So this is something needs more work. They had a series of meetings. Of course, they took sides in conflicts because of their own need for support from the Soviet Union, etc. But that story is something badly needs some theorization. It hasn't been done because now nobody wants to be called non-aligned, therefore there is a tendency to ignore it. But this, by the way, is one of the strategies of weaker parties. Paul Schroeder talks about a series of strategies transcending, hiding, bandwagoning. Non-alignment can be one of them, and potentially I have a feeling that if China-US rivalry emerges, this could re-emerge as another form of, may not be exactly what it was, but it may be a strategy in a kind of hedging mode. So what is the core of the argument? The denial of legitimacy to the threatening great power is one of the efforts of institutional soft balancing. Great powers use institutions to legitimate their power or delegitimize the power and threatening policies of their opponents. And this is interesting because here I'm going into the English school, which has put a lot of emphasis on what you call legitimacy. Legitimacy is defined as a tacit acceptance of social structure in which power is exercised. And the Free Dictionary definition is even better. It's lawfulness by virtue of being authorized or in accordance with law. Gaining legitimacy through institutions is part of a great power's effort to gain acceptance by others for its behavior. Even when great powers, revisionist powers, sometimes don't pay attention, but generally great powers want legitimacy, international legitimacy, and especially the liberal kind of great powers. And so this idea enshrined in classical realism as well as other classical texts needs to be studied more than the typical English school or even the constructivists look at this subject. So the post-Cold War period, the first 2 decades, what is interesting is these processes have been going on and we haven't really theorized this. And that's where I hopefully make some case for this process. The rise of China has happened without a really hard balancing coalition against it. India is not engaging in hard balancing of the estuary years, limited hard balancing and soft balancing and engagement with the US, with Japan, etc. Russia is also not facing the kind of intense, although a little bit more than China, in terms of its aggressive policies. I won't go into all these cases. I have chapters on each one of them and the reasons why China in particular is not facing the kind of balancing that one would expect. The US case is the most prominent one. It is the one that generated the kind of discussion. And the 2 cases that I pick up in there, the Kosovo invasion, 1999 intervention, and then the Iraq war. In both cases, the first case, it was Russia and China preventing UN authorization, and the allies had to go to NATO, European Union mechanisms. And Russia played a significant role in the final outcome of that conflict. 2003, you have the coalition now include Germany and France and quite a few other states. And the Bush administration, as you know, went to the UN for several weeks trying to project this idea that this Saddam Hussein holds nuclear weapons, etc. We need to get rid of him. Did not get the resolution. But the question is, it did go to the UN Security Council to obtain that approval, but it did generate the limited diplomatic coalitions that we are talking about. And the soft balancing became attractive for the secondary states. Primarily, the US power was overwhelming. US is a collective, a public goods provider. US can retaliate, but soft balancing, you cannot retaliate as much as with hard balancing. So their effort was to show that the United States' behavior was less legitimate. The international community does not approve this behavior, and that it is also aimed at the American public opinion. Collective legitimation of the United Nations or a multinational regional institution is pivotal to make American hegemony rule-bound. So people are not questioning American hegemony per se, but to make it more rule-bound. Of course, the US ignored under Bush administration, but it ended up in a very cumbersome war, and it had an enormous impact domestically. President Obama, as a candidate, one of his biggest arguments was that we have become very unpopular in the world. We need to get out of this war because otherwise we will not be considered as this legitimate hegemonic power. And so I argue that that was a success for soft balancing. Now, not to stop the war, but the fact that it prevented or it encouraged the American public to elect this newcomer. And he withdrew, of course, had to go back for other reasons. But the point is that the domestic opinion changed in favor of withdrawal and to regain American legitimacy, American reputation internationally, tarnished by this intervention. And I see that the more and more Mr. Bush is very unhappy with the coterie that advised him to engage in that war, but I wish he paid a little bit more attention to other advisors at the time. Now, the rise of China is, as I mentioned, is increasingly happening slowly but clearly in a different mode than what it used to be. It's a peaceful rise or peaceful development, but there is a lot of wedge strategy. China itself is engaging domestically in democratic countries, as well as developing asymmetrical capability, mostly outer space-based or other capabilities to compete with the United States and, according to Xi Jinping, one day replace the United States. I don't know how long that will take. So balancing against threat seems to be happening a lot more than balancing against power. And you look at this, the behavior of the states, I list them here, in particular ASEAN countries. The ASEAN behavior cannot be called hard balancing. Of course, some of them have limited cooperation with the United States. There's a lot of soft balancing there. They have this annual meeting called ASEAN Regional Forum. They engage the great powers, and they have a code of conduct idea of negotiations. They have gone to, Philippines have gone to the International Tribunal, got a legal verdict in its favor, although domestic politics is a very different matter. I want to talk a little bit about the favorable conditions, Russian story I mentioned. So these are the reasons why you don't have the intense hard balancing today, but that could change in a period of time. So what are the ideal conditions for soft balancing to emerge and to be an active part of state behavior? First of all, the threat environment has to be low. Great powers resort to institutions prominently during the early post-war years. The golden era of institutions is the first 2 decades of post-war or similar to that, that's the end of the Cold War. Institutions decline. This is another topic that nobody has, as far as I know, how do and why do institutions decay? Domestic institutions also decay. Democracy can decline. You need to sustain democracy. You need to nourish institutions. And what happens after the initial, in the international institutions arena, the fatigue wears out, people start losing its interest, and they think that it is going to happen anyway. Let us go back to our old ways. The second factor is international order gives great powers opportunity to make substantial economic progress without conquest. This is where I praise the United States for its globalization. Of course, now some critics would say you let China to become too strong. But whatever it is, in very historical terms, very rarely this happened. The rising power was not allowed to grow as fast as it could. So globalization helped China and India to a great extent. Bringing out a lot of people from out of poverty doesn't mean that inequality hasn't increased. So globalization, despite all its negatives, has been good for the rising powers in abstract terms, of course, and in concrete terms if you look at the numbers. Legitimacy matters to great powers. Legitimate power has its advantages because legitimacy is respected. Great powers believe in the legitimacy of key institutions. That's very important. 4, the level of nationalism is low among great powers, And finally, military technology and geographic configurations do not allow quick advancement and territorial changes, as it allowed the cult of the offensive, the Germans, to think about blitzkrieg as a strategy that the tank and the aircraft provided them. I want to spend a bit of time responding to, now this, you look at all these are slowly changing. This is why it is scary. The world order is becoming much more problematic because you can find changes in all over. The last one in particular, we have no idea what warfare is going to be in the second half of 21st century. What AI is going to do. They may replace soldiers. I don't know what that will do to the idea of chivalry, the idea of compassion, you know, the animals, or not even animals, the machines fighting, entering territories and all that. A lot of outer space activities going on, which is not known to most of us. So I won't go into that. We can discuss in the Q&A. There's a chapter discussion about responding to critics. It generated a lot of interest, but a lot of criticism. The criticisms are the following. There is little empirical support for this phenomenon, a simple diplomatic friction and not a concerted policy, episodic behavior and hence it lacks legitimacy, a rhetorical device rather than an active policy instrument, not too many cases to make a theoretically strong argument. As a policy instrument, success is not guaranteed, may have relevance only under conditions of unipolarity and hence little value for other systems. So I argue that these criticisms are not correct. Soft balancing has considerable empirical support, and the chapters from Concert of Europe onward shows that it is indeed a practice that states followed without, of course, calling it as it is. Second, it is not day-to-day simple diplomatic friction. The case studies show again that great powers use institutions on a consistent basis to restrain the power and aggressive policies of targeted powers. Non-great power states also increasingly use these institutions. Third, the policy of soft balancing is a rational response and often caused by the difficulties of relying on hard balancing to achieve behavioral change. Imagine attempting hard balancing toward China for smaller states today. Unless China becomes very predatory, threatening their existence, the incentives is very low because China will immediately cut you off from their trade relationship. It is the number one trading partner of almost all states in the world today, especially Asia Pacific. And what will be the impact on their economies? So these are the ways security and economics are connected, which often are not given the kind of, we kind of look at it as all straightforward, boxes. Fourth, there is no guarantee that hard balancing efforts can create peace, as balance of power is seldom achieved on a permanent basis. In fact, another of your prominent scholar here, Ernie, has talked about 8 meanings of balance of power. They couldn't even define, and he actually did a great job in showing that how complicated balance of power in the European context. The implicit assumption is that military balancing tends to work more effectively, or states favor this approach than the other for the lack of more effectiveness. No evidence that hard balancing always works. In fact, this idea of equality, equilibrium, is a very dangerous idea. In fact, my dissertation turned book on asymmetric conflicts. The weaker parties look at ways to break the so-called asymmetry, even extreme weaker ones. And if you look at the history of warfare, it took about 3 to 5 times superiority for the Allied powers to beat Germany at the end. What does that tell you about balance of power? I'm not saying balance of power is totally unimportant, but it is a complicated mechanism when we started look at this. And the European great powers believed it as not just an art, but as a science. And if you look at the way the British and all engage in series of conflict, but it is now becoming extremely difficult in this complex milieu to apply those same techniques. Kind of looking at the other soft ideas, soft law, those who do international law, it's a very important part of international law. Without soft law, there is no international law because countries don't want full legal rights or legal responsibilities. You have soft power, as TJ was mentioning, an important component of national power. Also, both are imprecise, yet valuable. So my argument is that this idea of soft balancing adds richness to discussion, and we need to look at softer approaches to see nuances of what's going on in the international arena, and that it is a mistake to sort of disregard all these other aspects, especially in a hedging world where countries have in a kind of insurance mode. And so this idea that institutions don't matter, Mearsheimer in particular has made this argument, I think it is a lack of political understanding of the value of institutions that is generating this. Why do great powers participate in a number of institutions? And then why do the weaker states form institutions? In fact, many regional institutions, ASEAN, APEC, all were created by weaker states, not the hegemonic powers. And they are still sustaining, by the way, the East Asia summits and the APEC meetings and the all ASEAN meetings attract all these presidents and prime ministers. They wear their attires in the annual meetings. If it is a useless exercise, why do they fly all the way to the Pacific and do this? And there is value in that, and we realize that value, and weaker states realize it doesn't solve all their problems. Maybe at some point they have to return to hard balancing, but at the moment it is not necessarily clear that's their strategy. So let me sort of conclude by emerging order. I think hard balancing need not work. It will generate intense hard balancing using alliances. Arms race is already happening, by the way, but that process could also result in considerable instability. And if I were to advise Xi Jinping has to return to Deng Xiaoping's dictums and try to rise peacefully as long as possible. There is no point in rushing, and soft balancing may help because you don't want to make too many enemies. Not a single state, as far as I know, has joined China in a military alliance, including the Russians. Why is that so? Because many of the Chinese goals are not the same as these other states. Of course, if there is a big bipolarity situation emerging and the Western countries become hostile to these two, potential for a bipolarity emerging is there. But the point is that these rising powers in particular have to look at the softer instruments, and that puts me to the last one, that is, so the point is the system is much more complex than what the European or immediate Cold War period was. It needs to be understood. And this is, of course, shows the dangers. I'm at Berkeley, so I can say things other places I can't. Populism, nativism, all happening. Dangers of deglobalization, pitfalls of abandoning institutions, dangers of arms buildup, and the US leadership. So, going back to the 2003 experience, I haven't given up hope. The American public is very interested in maintaining American status, good name, reputation, etc. I have a feeling that a powerful coalition of anti-Trump forces could change this narrative. Of course, there has to be structural changes, policy changes, particularly dealing with the issue of inequalities and the kind of propaganda that is going on. So, soft balancing does not solve all our problems. In fact, it can generate unwanted nationalism and conflict. I'm very aware of that, and the chapters discuss that. But it should be carefully used as part of a mix of strategies, given the complexity of international order in the 21st century. Let us not throw away institutions. Institutions serve certain functions beyond the functionalist approach or liberal approach, that they can be restraining threats as well as threatening powers. So I'll stop there, and we have some time and take some questions. Thank you, TJ.
Thank you very much, TV. I'll field the questions because we're recording this, and I'll repeat the questions from folks in the audience. But anybody like to get us started on this?
I guess they agree with me completely.
I will kick things off by simply saying, if you were in the White House with the convictions that you hold, what would be your advice in terms of soft balancing institutional use regarding a rising China? Because it seems as though the current administration is not at all interested in utilizing institutions in the ways that you talk about.
Yeah, I think it's a mistake to abandon institutions. The current administration is also doing this freedom of navigation thing. Yesterday, one went through. It's not stopping China. Unless you can reconquer those islands, very unlikely that the Chinese would completely abandon. So what's the recourse? The recourse should include, of course, I am actually in favor of the freedom of navigation, the navigation acts, because somebody has to do something about this grossly illegal act the Chinese have done. But you need to support ASEAN. You need to support the regional states. You need to support the code of conduct activity that's going on, which would mean sitting down with the Chinese, which they are doing a little bit here and there. And you need the support of your allies, including Australia, New Zealand. By the way, the poor countries are now, they're big targets of Chinese activism. I don't know anybody watches the New Zealand Prime Minister, a wonderful lady who was snubbed by this just yesterday. I get these regional news, and it's fascinating to see what China is doing. And to prevent this sort of engaging China is very important. Of course, economic sanctions, containment may be the recourse, but to abandon and to create coalitions of the willing, the Chinese are successfully creating a wedge among them. And the US action is not helping in bridging that wedge, especially the ASEAN states. So institutions should be very much part of the American efforts and help build bridges between Japan and India in particular, which the US has been doing. But I think the Trump administration has somewhat lessened, except the military, by the way, I think is very active in that domain. But economically, things are not shaping well. They should come up with a counter to BRI. United States, Japan, India should come up with a counter. They have this idea of Africa corridor, whatever, but it hasn't been properly implemented. Fearing that, or expecting that China will fail. I know China could fail and there will be huge indebted nations there. But China could also make inroads if you have the so-called East India Company problem. So on the softer sides, that include the BRI, it's not self-balancing, or other institutional sides, the US leadership is needed a lot more. It is good to say we are creating these huge ships and armada, but they cannot fight the battle. Or the nuclear weapons, unbelievably, $1 trillion is going into nuclear weapons. Neil, sorry to question this idea. I think we need deterrence. They serve a purpose. But look at the other forms of threats, other kinds of threats and the subtle games the Chinese are playing and the regional states are playing. We need to be more agile. And the US had that ability. The immediate post-Cold War period, so much effort went into creating this Marshall Plan and a series of plans. So one biggest mistake is abandoning this opportunity for world students to come to United States to study, including places like this, that generate ideas about liberal internationalism to a great extent. Of course, some opposite too. But the point is that the US cannot abandon its leadership role and use hard power, hard balancing, hoping that will make things work. That may work, I don't know, but very unlikely. The subtle forms of policies the Chinese and others, or even the Russians, are playing today to achieve their goal, that is higher status and power.
Thank you. Kevin?
Yeah, I think it's always
Please
hard.
introduce for the paper.
Political science here. I work on China. Yeah, I think it's always hard to show the impact of institutions on politics. But one thing that always occurs to me is if you do a thought experiment and imagine a world without these global institutions,
Exactly.
it will be a much more mearsheimer realist kind of a world. And that suggests something is going on through these institutions that is checking power in one way or another. Particularly in China, I'm curious, what do you think to be the role of China in global institutions, and its approach to global institutions these days? Because at least I'm struck when I take a look at things like the Shanghai Economic Cultural, or this Economic Cultural Organization, the AIIB. China is in some extent setting up other institutions, but at the same time it's participating in the institutions that exist through the UN and other sorts of things, by the way. And it may even be creating the conditions for it to be soft balanced by actually partaking in this bigger global order that everybody else seems to be hell-bent on deconstructing at this moment. So what's your sense
actually,
of where China fits with institutions?
Yes, your question. China is cleverly using institutions, creating its own, as you said. But I have some issues with the way China, this whole BRI from AIIB or BRICS to that process. First, I want to bring in Mearsheimer and this whole realist claim about hard balancing records. Balancing is the only thing that matters. The problem is a selective reading of history. There are periods when hard balancing rules the realm. It's very clear. There are periods when they don't really happen as much as the concert era, immediate concert era. So the selective picking of cases, which because they're most visible, very easy to do. And recently I had to read this dissertation turned book for a university press, basically arguing that hard balancing is the only way to go. I think it's a Mearsheimer student, but the point is, this is the only way to go, which really provoked me to write 10 pages showing that where all it failed, and only brief periods you find the actual balancing workings. People are trying to break the balancing most often. So picking this, and then the other argument is that it's coming. Okay, it's like tiger is coming. Well, we know some of us will get heart attacks, but if we are careful, maybe we don't. We may get other problems. But what the problem with this hard balancing argument, or it's coming, therefore, rivalry is coming, therefore, what are we supposed to do? Are we going to put all the power into structure, or are we going to give some importance to agency? Agency is what institutions, diplomacy, engagement, all this do. Coming to China. I think China did a wonderful job by bringing these states into AIIB and the BRICS. That process of making others responsible stakeholders, such as India. There's no opponent, as far as I remember, opponent to this idea of BRICS and AIIB in India, whereas BRI is a Chinese-led initiative. So that transition has made others wonder what the actual Chinese intentions are. So China, instead of using the idea of this Eikenberry-style institution interlocking other partners, went into this unilateral mode, and now it is facing some crises, and many countries are abandoning. Maldives, the latest, which by the way had to get $1 billion from India to pay China. And Sri Lanka, I visited there last year. There's a lot of domestic unhappiness with the way China is bringing laborers and all that. China could do much better, train the local workforce, including in Pakistan, by the way, which has this huge Chinese investment going on. If you don't train the Pakistanis in engineering and other subjects, they are going to be just laborers, even if that also Chinese labor is taking on. What kind of relationship this will develop between these two powers? Now there is a common threat, that is India. That's why the Chinese the Pakistanis are somehow, and they have nobody else to go to. So I think the Chinese are misreading their opportunity to become a benign great power. They are bound to get there. In another 20 years, they are number one economy, even if there is considerable. And India, by the way, Mr. Modi claims number 2, of course, he's using some data, putting US number 3. Potential is there in 50 years, not in the lifetime of me, I know that much. So the point is, these countries should not rush. The Chinese are very clever people. In fact, they had this series of articles and shows about past historical mistakes great powers did. This rushing, this tendency to rush when you are, the kind of power transition rush is unnecessary. Of course, China has done much better than one has to appreciate. Their grand strategy is a lot better than the previous grand strategies of European great powers, rising powers. But if China abandons its soft power, its soft balancing, or trying to push it too hard, as the Confucian institutions are in deep trouble, as you know, it does not become attractive. So attractiveness, soft power is important for that matter, had to become attractive. And the other big problem is the liberal states allow foreigners to come and live. People like a majority sitting here I can see are from some other part of the world. Can you become Chinese? Why can't China allow a little bit, maybe they will at some point, allow maybe the Singapore model, the Hong Kong model, I don't know. I mean, the point is, the kind of hegemony they're trying to acquire is a little bit of mixture of the old style, the idea of tributary model, etc. Some are dated consumption, some are based on historical injustices playing up. But China is going to get there. India is going to get there. Fix your domestic problems, but not get into wars and conflicts and alienating all your potential allies. So that's the advice. Sorry.
I just want to make two comments. One is that there is this kind of dazzle that, oh my God, India's writing, China's writing. And if you just go read my former undergraduate professor's book, A.F. Karaganski, World Politics textbook, the last chapter is all about why China will be the most richest #1 country in the world economically, and India will be #2, which he wrote in 1968. It's right there, you can go read it. And he was the one who invented power transition theory. So this whole idea, it's a very simple argument. If you have a large population, the country with the largest population times per capita income based on economic development leads to the largest economy. So this whole dazzle, my God, China has written so on, is a big surprise. But when I listen to you, it sounds like wishful thinking. And why can't China do this and why can't China do that? And I think of this Chinese official I met, I won't say where or who he was, just to be diplomatic. And he was going on and on about China's peaceful rise. This is about 5 or 6 years ago. Because I'm a professor who likes to provoke people. I said, I'm very surprised you keep talking about China's peaceful rise. This is antithetical to basic theory. Ken Walls, my colleague, has talked about realism and balancing. You seem to be totally ignorant of basic international relations, just to provoke him. And he says, today peaceful, then we'll see.
Yes.
So it seems to me that's kind of an argument that maybe they've, went too fast right now. They should have waited on the islands and so on. But why do we not think that their intentions are clear? You're just saying wait a little while before you start dominating everybody, right? But at the end, they're going to dominate everybody anyways. So maybe Trump's view is not so idiotic. Well, let's try to stop them from doing what's going to happen down the road by starting now. And I'm hardly a supporter of Trump's policies in general, but just to forsake.
Yeah, I think they themselves have a history that is different. At least they claim the whole Tianxia or the tributary model, which is not domination of the Western kind. Okay, if we believe, by the way, that itself is problematic because they were only one of the civilizations that dominated Asia. I just wrote a paper for this conference in Australia. People forget that there was an Arabic world. There was an Indic world, there was Genghis Khan's Mongol world in the Asia Pacific. Around the time the Chinese are talking about their, your student Kang, I disagree with him on this subject, although he's a friend of mine too. But the point is, speaking these cases where the Chinese did influence, that's Korea or partly Japan sometimes Vietnam, and then there's unknown places, nobody knows those places. Is not sufficient. Southeast Asia is a composite historical influence, Indian civilization and Chinese civilization. And Indian civilization has contributed a lot more. Sanskrit, look at their names, their culture, their cuisine, whatever. Indonesia in particular. Anyway, I don't want to go that far into. I won't call it wishful thinking. The Chinese themselves, Deng Xiaoping is a very significant figure you look at, trying to achieve many things. And he also had the statement that sit until you can stand or whatever. But what do you do when you stand is very important. How you play your hegemony. The Chinese actually are using this tributary model a lot these days, kind of overplaying it. And my surprise, the Taiwanese are the ones writing about it, historians on Taiwan, at least in this conference I was, a lot more friendlier terms. Maybe they think that if China adopts tributary model, Taiwan could be somehow, I don't know what it is. But the point is, China doesn't need an intense balancing coalition against it, and it prevented it so far. This has to be given credit to China. That is not the case of European rising powers in general. Of course, there may be some exceptions. Part of it is they were in a big rush. The Germans thought that the Russian railway is going to change the world. And there are studying showing that a lot of it is some leaders think that I have to get this done in my lifetime. Is Xi Jinping one of that? That's the challenge. But to achieve the goals, China did well for the period Deng Xiaoping and the two subsequent premiers, leaders. China did much better than today in terms of the hostility it is generating. The question is, well, if you want hostility, if you want intense rivalry, go for it. But if you ask the same Chinese, do you want that? They want, by the way, everybody in China want to be loved. They're so very picky about, finicky about even tiny criticisms. Try to make a criticism. They feel very bad that you are not good to us, How do you avoid that if this phase, that is status, prestige, all these soft variables matter? How do you achieve hegemony without being threatening? It's not easy, I agree. At some point they may. But in this paper I just mentioned, China will never be controlling the world, okay? Sorry to say that. As long as India is there, as long as Japan is there, of course it's declining, but as long as the United States is there, 21st century, even beyond that, the domination may be very different as what with the European industrial eras, European industrial world. It may be technological, a lot of things are happening. Nationalism is a powerful force. Great powers of the yesteryears just go and conquer. There was hardly any resistance, barring in a few places. Today, is that the case? All the South Asian states, I study a little bit of them, they're playing both China and India. Of course, they may get more money from China, but they're going to India to gain some. And so there is this counter action is going on with China's, and China has not created a solid alliance, which is very unlikely even with Russia. So it's going to be a long battle if it becomes extreme aggressive nationalism. And it is in China's interest that what made China China today, that is insertion into the global economic system. And that economic system is absolutely necessary for China to sustain and to become prosperous. So dominance, I don't know. I think some people say if India puts its act together, domestic act, it has a lot more potential than we think. Of course, everybody you visit India seems that what are the bureaucracy doing here, the politicians, that's another sad part of the story. I don't know. It's up in the air.
Other comments or reactions? Yes, gentleman in the back.
Taking note of the role of smaller states in the construction of institutions that helped kind of bring in this idea of soft balancing, do you not believe that soft states could kind of take the place of the United States in leading, what were you saying, like that kind of like coming back to the soft balance as opposed to like that hegemony?
Well, that's where the non-alignment comes into the picture. You need leadership for that. You had a Nehru who, anybody studied Nehru is a very impressive man. He struggled, freedom struggle, was in the British jails and studied in Britain, liberal in many sense. A very impressive figure when you think about. His biggest fear was that hard balancing or the balance of power will make imperialism again repeat itself. That a third world war will force us to be part of it, and the smaller states will be the victims of that war. And he had sympathizers even in liberal democratic countries and managed to create a coalition. That is very difficult today because many states are tied to China economically. They need the market. Some are tied to the United States as well. So countries are hedging, basically, even small states, up to a point, in that they are using institutions, but you visit ASEAN countries like Singapore, they will not reject institutional source of their power, but they know the limitations. They are afraid that if they are too strong taking a position or form coalitions, that may generate backlashes. As, by the way, Canada, Australia, New Zealand are facing the Chinese wrath today. I probably can't visit China right now, they say, because they're warning against anybody going to China, which is probably unfair because a lot of people are going. But the point is, the Chinese strategy has been to create wedge in domestic situations by doing all kinds of strategies. You know, the Huawei thing, the whole 4G, 5G thing is happening. Small states are reluctant, but small states are playing different kinds of games whenever they can. ASEAN, I mentioned South Asian states, Bangladesh, Nepal, you know, all these states weak in many ways. They are also kind of playing with India. They immediately go to India, try to get a matching support. And Bangladesh, by the way, is getting a lot money out of China. Nepal getting quite a bit. Now that strategy has limitations. It may work up to a point. But what the world is lacking is leadership for even to organize them at the United Nations or other forums. You are missing. The ASEAN had some good leaders in the past, the Rajaratnams and the Lee Kuan Yews, you know, that is missing today. So there is a considerable weakness, and potentially leading countries like India doesn't want to be part of that coalition, want to be considered as a rising power along with China, you know. So who will take the leadership? But they are doing work in whether World Trade Organization or a regional association like APEC and processes. You find a lot of institutional balancing is going on. It needs more cooperation, but that also depends how fast, how far China becomes a threat to them, or the United States for that matter. So it's connected to threat. I mean, it's balancing against threat to some extent, to their existence as nation states. Right now, neither the US nor China pose an existential threat as previous rising powers did. So that is an important consideration to look into.
I would suggest that you might be able to get to China, but the question is, would you get back? I think the gentleman in the back had his hand up earlier.
Yeah, I had a question. Maybe you addressed it. I had to step out for a minute. But we were talking about the BRI in relationship to potentially reproducing what you call the East India Company problem. Can you say a little more about it? What's the BRI?
You know what
BRI
is
the Belt and Road Initiative. That's a Chinese initiative to, I know.
the resurrecting the whole Silk Road also. Yeah, I'm sure many of you know what the East India Companies were. The Dutch were the first to come up with the East India Company. Indian Ocean was the theater of the rivalry. Basically, you come to the shores of these large masses, but gain access, trading posts. Then you slowly wait for your turn, create a kind of wedge among the local princes, kingdoms. You gain one step, and over a period of time, you acquire land and trading privileges. Then after some time, it becomes British India, by the way, or Dutch India, or French India, you know, part of it were all, and spread to the other parts of the world. So the East India Company initially was a private enterprise supported by the British monarch, but only after the first battle, that's the 1857, that the company was taken over by the British monarch, Victoria's declaration. So East India Company syndrome, it's a syndrome which is, you don't go initially with this idea of conquering. In fact, they come as traders, majority of them. They didn't have big armed forces with them. But they also recruit local armed forces to join hands. So over a period of time, you gain complete control over the colonies. That's how colonialism happened, at least in the Asia-Pacific context. Of course, in the South, you know, in South America and all is a different process, direct conquest to some extent. So the East India Company syndrome is that if the locals are weak or not paying attention, you can gain into highly indebted situations. So Sri Lanka is now the most interesting case. There is a port town called Tota, which has been taken over by the Chinese because of the debt was so high the the Sri Lankans could not pay back. So a particular area, when I visited, the Sri Lankan laborers were fighting outside. They were all ejected from the port, and Chinese laborers were brought in. So kind of a sovereign part of China now, in some sense, although legally probably not. 99-year-old lease. Okay, the East India Company also signed a 99-year lease for Hong Kong. You may recall that. That's how this idea of East India Company comes in. And so during that process, East India Company has created bases across. China is slowly starting to create base, Djibouti one, then Pakistan, potentially. So the model is difficult one because, like I said, resistance was meager in the case of previous East India companies, and the locals supported them because kingdoms used them to conquer or gain something else. But the British grand strategy was very successful. At the end, things all are British, or at least 11 provinces. So, and the rest, by the way, are under British suzerainty. India was not completely under British rule. There are 500 kingdoms, but ultimately there is a British resident there. So East India Company syndrome is a fascinating idea of colonialization. Now, whether China can replicate that, because East India companies also defeated one another. The Dutch were running around, by the way, for about 150 years in the Indian Ocean. People don't realize that you have to go to Sri Lanka and where I come from, Kerala, to see some Dutch remnants. They were running the show on that coastline after defeating the Portuguese. Then the British came. They still have left their marks on all these places. And so the idea whether China can replicate that, and what is fascinating is the European colonial powers also had these arrangements, like the Pondicherry. You stay there as long as you don't bother us, but they were defeated in the war, Carnatic Wars in particular. So there is a tacit arrangement. Whether China can replicate, where will India go? It is positioned quite well in the Indian Ocean. It's not going to easily give up the struggle, even though it may agree with some of them. And where will Japan go? Where will the United States go? Where all these, Indonesia, there's pretty big states out there. And African countries are also sensitive to whatever you do. So it is not clear the typical East India Company problem will arise, but it may be something to watch out if they are overly dependent on one state. So that's the big issue.
Yes.
Do you consider the current U.S. efforts to equalize trade with China a good soft balancing technique?
Economic balancing, maybe. I'm mostly interested in military or security side. So there is room for a great work on economics balancing, how economic considerations come into play. One of my colleagues, Mark Brawley, did some work on that, but still, I don't know whether you guys know more. It isn't done enough to look at the principle of balancing in the economic arena. The US efforts, I think surprisingly many states are just keeping quiet, hoping it will happen because they are also worried about their own trade. But the question is, what I worry is there will be some patching agreements and then things go back to the same. Or there will be, so what is needed is a global agreement on some of these issues, because China's problem is not just with the United States alone. Of course, the US could take the leadership role. China used WTO for advancing or the kind of things. Why not think of a global institutional structure whereby China can be economically engaged and self-balanced and play the rules of the game? Otherwise, what is our recourse? Every time there is Chinese trade is higher, are you going to go to a tariff situation? So abandoning the global trading regime is a mistake for other states too. We need to think of institutions and rules to make China a stakeholder and playing by rules. It probably is not in some cases. But the defenders of China say that countries, others have to be blamed also for what it is. I know for India, Indian economy will not work if the Chinese machinery doesn't come to India. Because a lot of this machinery India cannot produce for as cheap as Chinese. And so China is doing, in a way, a good thing for making India's growth 7.5% today. But the trade balance is huge there. China is in favor of China, 72 billion or something. Out of that, India's side is 20-some million and Chinese side is the rest. There's a lot of unhappiness, but nobody is really making a big deal out of it. I don't know why, but maybe it's they know their own difficulties. So, to answer your question, we need to think of now broadening these concepts larger than what I have been talking about.
If I could just piggyback on that very quickly to respond. It seems to me that the criticisms that the United States has vis-a-vis China get to the heart of the Chinese economic development model. It's about forcing mergers with incoming companies from abroad, forcing technology transfer, stealing technology in some cases, etc. These are issues that not only the United States, but a number of other countries have issues with. And I think the mistake that the United States is making is that it has abandoned these institutions, these international approaches. It would be far easier if 5 European countries, Japan, Korea, etc., joined with the United States to put pressure on China to change some of its fundamental approaches. But now it's simply a one-on-one bilateral bargaining arrangement, and the Trump administration has backed away from using the kind of institutional balancing act that I think we're trying to get.
TTP would have been an
TTP
institution,
would have been,
economic balancing.
But in any event, I did see somebody else. Was it you? Yes,
Well,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Two things. One, a comment about what you just said.
Oh, that's
It
sorry.
seemed
I
to
didn't mean
me, it seemed to me that China was selling its market, its population to American companies if they went into China and produced Buicks. So in trade for the access to that market, they wanted the technology transfer. It was almost an economic exchange, market for tech. But going back to this British colonization,
Not the most interesting.
as I understand it, that was a net loss.
For the British,
Yes,
that's debated.
over the period of time, in two ways. But when they went into India, the purpose, as I understand it, was to stop the Indians from industrializing and making them a source of raw materials. And that's why Gandhi was doing the spinning wheels with the thing to sort of defy that. And so, it actually would have benefited Britain to encourage industrialization around the world and increase its own activity in trade and world trade rather than suppressing industrial development.
Very true.
So with China, with this Silk Road thing, they want to, it would seem to me, increase economic activity around the world. So I don't see that as so negative.
Yeah, I mean, whenever you are dependent, dependency creates issues, no?
Two-way trade, industrialization.
If it is two-way trade, but if it is one-way trade, that's when
Well, if it's one-way trade, it's less economically advantageous to China, as I
Yeah.
was just trying to illustrate with the British.
I actually agree with the British model of development is very much extraction, exploitation to some extent. You may recall that by 18th century, India had 26% of world trade, China had 36% of world trade, by the way. World economic, Paul Kennedy has his nice, and by the time the British left, it was 1% of global economy, India. So it was mostly extracting the cotton and developing them.
Because the world economy was expanding so much, so the percentage would go down. But
Yeah, but those are all. What I agree with you is the British were smart. They had the wherewithal. They created infrastructure, such as railways, telegraphs, etc. But they didn't help create a local bourgeoisie, a middle class. They were all mostly servants, workers, rather than creating that. Some did happen, by the way, in the port cities of Gujarat or Bombay, a place like that. But you don't get a sense that this was one of the part of the strategic calculation. This was imperialism raw, okay? Domination. So even though they did a few things, but there's a nice video by Shashi Tharoor, this Indian popular politician. He's debated Oxford University, where he argues that the British owe India some $2-3 trillion, pounds. And I was thinking that if the British had to give that much money, there won't be a Britain left because there's nothing left there now. So it's a very contested argument whether it was a net loss for them. They ended up in this war. By the way, the British decline happened because of certain wars that they fought, and somewhere their unwillingness to accommodate rising powers to some extent. There's an interesting, one of my PhD students is working at how defeated powers were treated by previous hegemons, okay? So the concept of Europe, the French were really nasty, what Napoleon did to the world, I mean, despite all his grandeur thing. But they were immediately taken back. At the Vienna meetings, they are running the show like nothing happened. They were given even arts and things that Napoleon looted. I have cited those things in the book. And whereas in the Versailles system, it is high retribution. It is Germany should suffer. The German chancellor or the representative brought in like a criminal and took out, you suffer, And
So that's another example of why China shouldn't do this kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, learning from history is very important. And the other model is the San Francisco model, 1945, where you have a partial system where great powers create a condominium, then creating two separate world orders. The Chinese model is something different emerging. Now, how China plays it out, how the United States also has to be careful. Do we want a war with China? Do we want another round of intense Cold War style? Cold War was an exception historically, by the way, isn't it? Athens and Sparta, or Rome and what was the other one? That was the historical examples. People go back so much. So, United States need China. China needs United States. We cannot think of a world without a Chinese market, Chinese ingenuity, Chinese people, how to create a world order where stakeholders feel part of it, accepting their status. All big questions, maybe for our next discussion.
Okay. We are pretty much out of time, so I think my job as moderator is also to call an end to things, and I realize that other questions may have been raised. Perhaps TV can hang around for a few minutes and answer them on a one-on-one, but let me ask you to join in thanking him for a very interesting talk.
Thank you for having me here.